heading into the Fitbit conversation, right? And you were a key subject matter expert when the whole acquisition happened. So can you just like say chronologically tell us like when did Fitbit get acquired by Google and like what was the story kind of coming Fit and Fitbit together? What was the larger vision, at least from your point of view?
What was posted publicly about the Fitbit acquisition was very much that it was about bringing the hardware proposition into the Google family. Google had been investing a lot in its hardware range to that point, and the Nest acquisition, for example, some years previous to that as well, had all kind of been part of that strategy. So I think that was a key element there. I think the other aspect was that health was clearly a big topic, still is a big topic. And Google saw there's an opportunity there to sort of really supplement what they were already doing in the health space. There's a careful integration effort and migration that needs to happen over time, and that's not just a technical migration either, right? You've got to take users along the journey with that. And we've talked about trust before in terms of the developer domain, but there's a lot of user trust that we've got to try and maintain through that whole journey. So that was one of the tough aspects.
Welcome to another episode of Building It Big. Today I have with me Matt Goodridge, who was the group product manager at Google, and he ran the product team for Google Fit. We have a lot to learn today about how Google Fit was built and how Fitbit came into being and what happened once Fitbit and Fit were working together. So really excited to have you with us today, Matt. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, and do you want to just start off with a quick introduction?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, I've spent my whole career pretty much in tech, but in so many different domains, and spent 10 years actually at Google, but having done a number of things before that. And but at Google, I was lucky enough to go through a number of different teams, of which the last one was really in Google Fit and Health, and then went on to work at a startup in medical devices before finally now I've built my own startup in something completely different, in trying to decarbonize the built environment.
Yeah, and again, congratulations for that, and I'm sure you'll eventually go and fix the health of the whole environment and the earth.
I hope so.
Right?
We're trying.
So, yeah, no, definitely. I'm very excited about that personally. So, kind of coming to our topic for today, which is Google Fit. And I've, of course, had the privilege of seeing you build a lot of things firsthand. Can you start off by just talking briefly about Google has a bunch of things in the arena of what you'd call health, right? So DeepMind, of course, does a few things. Then there's Google Health, there's Google Fit, and then, of course, the Fitbit acquisition that happened. Can you unpack a little bit in terms of what are the different products and how do they, say, cross-collaborate / coexist together?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on in Google, and I think there still is in the health arena. I mean, focusing on Google Fit for a moment. That was a core part of the watch offering. So Google had Android Wear, which worked on a number of different watches, from whether it was from Samsung or other device OEMs. And Google Fit was part of that Android package, really, and it was a fundamental piece to help users track their health with the sensors that were available on the wearable device there. And then, of course, there was also a Google Fit app that worked with the watch, but if you didn't have a watch, that was also fine, right? And the idea is to bring the basics of health tracking to anybody that had an Android phone, or indeed wanted to use Google Fit on an iPhone. So that was one piece. There were a lot of other things going on in health. So from Google's search efforts and making sure that when people were looking for symptoms or different pharmaceuticals, that they could get reliable information through search. There was a lot going on with how does Google help hospitals and clinicians actually find medical data. And there was some work going on in diagnostics as well, and a lot of work with Google's efforts around machine learning and image processing and recognition to help diagnostics. So broad range of different stuff. I would say a lot of that was quite separate, and a big effort was trying to bring a coherent strategy together.
Yeah, and I think this is like another, you could say, value proposition that Google brings in, very much attached to its mission, like bringing in the words knowledge and information together, right? Like health, I think, is a vertical which essentially is a part of everybody's life, is the life, right?
Yep.
And how do you bring value to users with the data that they have? It's kind of the core remit of, you could say, you and the team that you were part of, partially.
Yeah, I mean, Google Fit was really trying to bring users on a journey to, I mean, fundamentally, our mission was to help people be healthier, right? And bring a combination of the data that was available out there, whether that was advice around particular conditions or whether that was just activity videos, remote classes, that kind of thing, all the way through to your data, like what was your step count, what was your heart rate today, over the last week, what are the trends, how do you help somebody continue to improve their fitness, their sleep, that kind of thing. No, that's very, very commendable that all of these pieces actually ended up working together and stuff. So diving a little bit about the areas that were in your remit, right? Like Google Fit. Can you speak a little bit about like what was the core value and what was the team that you were managing kind of looking at? So, I mean, the core value is really about taking users on this journey, right, of improving fitness and health more generally. And so there were areas around core activity, so whether that was steps or heart rate, and how we had this concept of heart points, which was how do we help people understand that intensity matters, right? It's not just about walking down the street slowly. If you pick up the pace, if you go running, if you raise your heart rate, then you can get additional points for the same amount of time, right? So the big effort around activity. There was quite a lot of work around sleep as well, and I think sleep is one of those things that people in their stressful, busy lives, often struggle with, right? And it's a big factor in how energetic people feel, how well they feel. There's a lot of connections with mental health as well, and getting enough sleep. So and sleep is affected by your activity, right? So it's not like these things are independent factors. So sleep was a big area, and how do we help people understand how well they're sleeping and make improvements. And then there was another area that we hadn't really sort of got a lot into, which was around nutrition, right? And we'd done quite a lot of sort of research around, well, what would be a good nutrition experience, but nobody's really cracked how do you input the data? How do you actually track? Like, there's lots of apps out there that will help you with your nutrition. But if you actually want to track what you're eating, it's quite laborious to enter everything in. And nobody's really figured out how to solve that. There was a few efforts we've seen across the board of like, can you take a picture of what you're eating and then that automatically recognize it? Even if you could crack that problem, right? Let's say you could get perfect image like plate recognition. Just getting somebody to take their phone out of their pocket and take a picture of what they're eating and remembering to do that is a barrier. And so that's a really, really big challenge. And then finally, the fourth sort of pillar was verging on the mental health side of things, and how do you help people understand where they're at on with their level of stress and relaxation on the other side, and bring about these small opportunities to get people to take a step back and just just chill for a bit, really. And so what we were trying to do in Google Fit was bring all of those 4 areas together as a sort of holistic approach to fitness and well-being, and get people to use those together.
Yeah. No, I mean, I completely agree with a lot of things, and actually all the things that you said, right? Like, I've used products like MyFitnessPal, which I presume have a really good library in terms of like the data set has a lot of food that you could select from. But then clicking that picture and all that, like that habit formation, of course, becomes a challenge as well. So speaking about, you mentioned a lot of data in this, right? Like in terms of like the nutrition data, whether that's wellness, sleep, and whatsoever. If I remember correctly, like end of the day, this became a data source as well, right? Like which can be leveraged by other apps and vice versa, right? How did that journey pan out?
So, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's lots of different data sources, and people use different apps for different things, right? You mentioned MyFitnessPal for nutrition tracking. There's obviously things like Calm for mental health. You might be an avid runner or a cyclist and use Strava, for example, for your activity. And one of the big challenges is connecting all of this stuff together, right? Because if you're deep into one area or maybe multiple areas, bringing that together and understanding the effects that they have on each other is really, really important. And so rather than something like Google Fit trying to be good at all of these things, which is a really big challenge, we saw, particularly with the association with Android, we saw ourselves more as like the data hub, and how can we bring about like this connection between all the different apps that a user might be using to deep dive in any given area, and see the sort of combined effects.
Right, and I think it also mirrors the ethos of Google, right, which begins from search. Of course, there's like an entry point for a user's journey, but then the content is not really Google's, right? Like whether that's coming from a news site or whatever other thing, right? So I think this is very similar to that whole DNA as well, right? So again, like now I presume from a user point of view, there's of course the user whose data exists on these platforms, but then there are also developers who would want to say provide more value. Like say, I think you've raised some good points with like Strava and MyFitnessPal and whatnot, right? So you had offerings for developers as well. So can you speak a little bit about that?
For sure, yeah. So the Google Fit had an API, and an app developer for a phone app or a watch app even could talk directly to that API on those devices, which was pretty convenient if they didn't have a sort of cloud backend. But there was also a cloud-based API as well. So if there was an app or service that was running mostly in the cloud, then that could interface to Google Fit as well, and we dealt with all of the synchronization between all of those devices. And so really sort of from that you had kind of different segments, right? I mean, there were those apps that were very much there for on the watch, and so you whether it was run tracking or there were golf apps that you could run on your watch where you didn't want to be taking out your phone all the time and doing stuff, right? Then there were obviously pure phone apps. Again, we talked about MyFitnessPal, but where you're logging your food, you're not going to do that on a tiny screen on a watch. So you might do that on a phone. And I think then on the API side, I think one of the most interesting use cases for the cloud or the web API is how do we interface with health professionals and the healthcare ecosystem. And that was one of the areas that I was actually trying to push personally is, we've got this wealth of data, right, that users are collecting themselves. And how do we enable those users to get better care from the clinicians that they're working with anyway, from all of the data that they're collecting personally? And so, that sort of cloud-based API was really targeted at that kind of very nascent area. No, and that's something which I'm like superly interested in, because in past life I've kind of like dealt with this whole area a little bit. So end of the day, I think any of these fitness tracking or any kind of like tracking applications
are a data entry source, right? And I think what Google's Fit, you could say, data source is essentially doing is building these pipes together and ensuring that there is data which is clean, which is kind of like coherent, it is kind of congruent across systems so that the synchronization works and whatnot. But making sense of that, which is kind of like, say, getting to the insight level, or like how do you start making not really predictions, but even at least a form of like, okay, here's a recommendation for you, right? What was that journey like? And onboarding a subject matter expert who I presume was a doctor on the floor, right? Like, how did that go? How did you even figure out? Because I think something sometimes which I've encountered as a product manager is like, you just don't have enough subject matter expertise to even know what to ask or what to like go down, right?
Yeah.
How did you build that muscle, and what was the journey like?
Yeah, so I mean, Google Fit on the team had a number of clinicians advising. So we had one cardiologist who I worked particularly closely with, and they were able to give a lot of advice around like, well, how does what we're trying to do from a sort of wellness and fitness and very much a sort of consumer angle sort of fit with the more clinical journey. And they also brought that level of kind of precision and need for science-based insights, which drove really both journeys. I mean, not on the consumer side, but also on the clinical side of the thinking. I think the challenge, though, which certainly during my time there we didn't manage to crack, is because we're now the data hub.
Yeah.
Right. Accepting data from all sorts of different places. What is the provenance of that data? And how do we? Let's say you've got heart rate data, right? And you might have a heart rate data from a watch. You might have heart rate data from I've got a ring here which monitors my heart rate when I'm sleeping. So you've got all these different sources, and how do we know how accurate it is? Because if we're putting our reputation on the line to say, well, we think you should be doing this, or hey, you should be going to see a doctor about that. How do we know that measurement is legitimate? And that, I think, is, ultimately the holy grail, right? But you needed to build that trust relationship, which we didn't get to yet while I was on the team.
And when you say the trust relation, was it with the user or with some authorities, or?
It's the trust relationship with the source of the data, right?
Sure.
So, let's say we're taking heart rate data off a ring.
Yeah.
How do we know that data actually came from that ring just because an app posted it on the API?
Yeah.
Well, did it actually come from the ring, or was it that app just making it up?
Yeah.
Right. Or something in between.
Yeah.
And then even when we know it came from that ring, well, how do we know that was well calibrated and that kind of thing? And so it's the trust relation. First of all, is the trust relationship with, that manufacturer of that sensor.
Yep.
And how do we build that? And then how do we, once we, that's really the trust piece.
Yep.
But then, if we're then interpreting somebody else's data, how are they going to feel about that? And should that developer be really driving those insights themselves? And should we be giving them the space to do that?
Yeah.
And just connecting the dots. But if you're trying to combine heart rate data and, let's say, activity data from Strava, let's say, then who's going to do that? Well, is it Strava, but then they need to have reliability of the heart rate data, or is it the heart rate source, but then they need to have reliability of the activity data? And how, there's a challenge around how do you broker that whole dynamic.
Yeah. And objectively, were you guys able to say that you solved it? Not really.
No, I don't. Well, certainly, they may have solved it now. I'm not.
Yeah.
I've been out of that team for 2 years now, but certainly when I was there, that was a big challenge that we were trying to figure out, and certainly didn't solve in my time.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point about trust, right? Because also from an end user perspective, somebody who's like putting the watch on and whatnot, right? These people kind of do expect, and I'm speaking entirely from a user's point of view here, I do expect, like say a Google or an Apple in this scenario, to tell me, right, or at least like have the right set of disclaimers which are in my face in certain aspect, right? Like say if I see like, oh, my heart rate is dropping, and if there's a disclaimer that, okay, take it with a grain of salt, but at the same time maybe you should do ABC. So what were some of those things that you did, or the team largely did, to kind of like build that trust also with the end user, so to speak?
I mean, I think it was part of it is making sure there's clear attribution of the data. So if you're looking at your Ring's heart rate data in the Google Fit app, being clear that this is where it came from, and even giving the user the opportunity to, tap that data and then launch the Ring app, right? And I think there was, when every app developer out there is really hungry for users' attention and say, well, I want the users' eyeballs on my app, right? It's very difficult to break the cycle break that mentality, even within our own team. And we were trying to be the arbiters of health data on a user's device. But how do we break away from us measuring our success based on how long the user spends within our app? And so I think that was a human challenge internally, and also how do you make that a smooth experience for the user though as well? So even if you said, right, we're going to allow users to navigate back to the apps where they were, that was the source of the data, how do we make sure that user can kind of easily come back again if they want to, right? And how much of an integration effort with each of those app developers is that? So giving users a sort of harmonious experience across all the various apps that they use, whilst being sort of fair and equitable to that developer community and not playing favorites, right? We don't want to necessarily say, well, we're in bed with Strava, but actually, Nike running, sorry, you haven't got those integrations, so you're not part of the club. We need to be able to have that degree of fairness, and so getting that balance right is really challenging.
So switching gears a little bit, Matt, I mean, we've of course spoken a lot about like data coming from like different sources, and like end of the day, there's like users at two angles, right? There's the developers of these apps, and then of course the users of the app who kind of leverage the platform indirectly. Insights is a very interesting space, right? It's good if it gets me all the value and whatnot, but I mean, there is a lot at stake because I'm kind of like putting my personal information out in the system, right? How do you, as a team, kind of like, how did you guys think about that? And I know, I mean, like Google has a really high standard of like PII, personally identifiable information, and how do you safeguard that, protect that? But does that ever, or did that ever come in the way of like being, having the ability to create the right models or like generators or whatever you call it?
I mean, I think it was an interesting, it was an interesting challenge for us. It's the way the privacy legislation has evolved, I think, has really pushed us to step our game up on what do we really want to offer the user, right? And that's the whole model around consent, right? You're asking a user, can I use your data for this purpose? And the user has got to see that they're getting value out of that. Right, and that's the jump. We can't, long gone are the days where we can just collect a bunch of data and then figure out later what we're going to do with it, right? And so that's got us to think, and this is true across the board, right? Health data is obviously the topic of today, but this is true everywhere now, and it means that we have to really think hard about. What are we really trying to achieve with the user? What is are we trying to help them get fitter? Are we trying to help them sleep better? Are we trying to help them manage a chronic condition like diabetes, for example? And really ask them, well, do you want us to track X, Y, and Z in order to help you with whatever it is that we want help with. And it's interesting because we did a research study a while ago now where we try to understand from users what their willingness to give up their health data was to a tech platform, right?
Yeah.
And we actually went as far as like asking about electronic health record data, and as well as health and fitness and what you'd get off a watch. And what was interesting was there was huge reluctance from users to just put that onto a sort of a digital platform, particularly one hosted by a large tech company, for no particular reason. Maybe it will be useful to me in that format sometime in the future.
Right.
However, as soon as you could say to them, well, hey, we can stitch all this together to help you solve a medical problem that you have now, completely game change in terms of their willingness to put that data, in that same system, right? There wasn't the way we positioned the research was that it's the same platform that we're putting the data on for those very different scenarios, and completely different appetite to make that data available in that way. And so I think that's where this comes back to consent, is what specifically are we trying to help the user with, and take them on that journey, and then we can help them make the best out of the data that they have already about themselves, whether that's from their wrist or in a doctor's office.
Yeah. And I mean, for a lack of a better word, as a user as well, I barter my data for that benefit or for that value, right? Like, so I think that's the exchange needs to be clear pretty much, right? So that's a solid point from a privacy angle, right? How did you ensure the other side of this curve, which is the developers? How do they get all of the data that would be beneficial for them to ultimately build the machine learning models and platforms, without really snooping into, say, data from EHRs or whatever?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's quite similar, right?
Yeah.
It's about when we've got an API that gives a developer access to this kind of data, it's about having fine-grained permissions.
Yeah.
And what we had in Google Fit when I was there, and I know this has moved on since then, is, getting access to activity data separately from your sleep data, separately from your heart rate data, right? All of these different separate switches, and so that when a developer goes in and says, hey, user, I want to get access to this, and this data, they're being very clear around, well, specifically what do they want access to, and then as part of the app review controls that were anyway part of the Play Store, we were making sure that there was clear declarations by the developer to say what they were using that data for. And so when the user was then consenting to this access, they could see, this developer's wanting heart rate data and they're using it for this.
Got it. And did you have, so of course you mentioned there were guardrails on the other side as well for developers, but then did you ever see like kind of any bad actors or like trying to game the system? Was there like an active audit which was going on at any point of time?
So I don't think I've got any sort of particular bad actor stories, but in terms of the audits, really what we did was we hooked into the approach that Google Play was taking anyway within the Android and the watch ecosystem, app ecosystem, and they already do review every app because they're looking for things like malware and other prohibited content, right?
Sure.
And so by hooking into that, we made sure that these were an additional set of policies that needed to be approved. And then there were different situations, right? Like apps would be, of course, they were reviewed the first time they were published, but apps are updated all the time, and there was sort of a top-up review that took place, and then there were. There were random checks, and if anybody complained, about a particular app, then it might get re-reviewed again depending on the nature of the complaint, right? So there were a number of different intervention points where app developers could be held to account.
And I think that's a good strategy in general, even from a Play Store point of view, because they are like the gatekeepers of everything which is accessible, right? Like, so having those spot checks and everything totally made sense. So now heading into the Fitbit conversation, right? And you were a key subject matter expert when the whole acquisition happened. So can you just like say chronologically tell us like when did Fitbit get acquired by Google, and like what was the story kind of coming Fit and Fitbit together? What was the larger vision, at least from your point of view?
We announced the Fitbit acquisition back in 2019. I think it was September, and then finally the acquisition closed. I think it was in January 2021. So that was sort of a pretty long journey, probably longer than most people expected. And the real strategy, I think, there was, as this was announced at the time, was to bring the Fitbit hardware range into the wider sort of Google hardware range. Google had been investing a lot in its hardware range to that point, and the Nest acquisition, for example, some years previous to that as well, had all kind of been part of that strategy. So I think that was a key element there. I think the other aspect was that health was clearly a big topic, still is a big topic, and Google saw there's an opportunity there to sort of really supplement what they were already doing in the health space. On the Google Fit side, I think clearly there was a lot of duplication, right? And I think to that point when Fitbit was acquired, Google Fit was it was a nice product, but it was a small product, right? The level of investment had been pretty modest, and it had a relatively tight set of features. So where we headed with that was that ultimately Fitbit would replace a Google Fit, and that's, I think, this continues to be what's happening. But of course, you can't just switch a product off like that had been around for many years. There's a careful integration effort and migration that needs to happen over time, and that's not just a technical migration either, right? You've got to take users along the journey with that. And we've talked about trust before in terms of the developer domain, but there's a lot of user trust that we've got to try and maintain through that whole journey. So that was one of the tough aspects.
No, I can certainly see that, right? And I think also when you say like health as a market is something everybody's trying to get in, I think also it is a Google size problem. To be very clear, right? Like, I mean, it is one of the areas or domains which does require someone like Google to at least come and establish, like, okay, here are the principles. This is how we do things. These are the layers, and then this is how user value can be generated, right? So I always saw that Fitbit was kind of layering up in that overarching story somewhere too, right? So anyway, so then. I mean, again, we've spoken to a lot of people who've built from, say, ground up, or like, say, started from somewhere. But then an acquisition is something which I always find a very interesting building block, right? And you kind of rightly pointed out that it's funny how like an acquisition gets announced on a day, and then by the time it's actually closed, it's like, I don't know, the years, calendars have changed and whatnot, right? Can you speak a little bit in terms of like what are the on the ground integration things that happen, right? And again, from a technical perspective, from a cultural perspective, because I think what a lot of people don't realize is when you try and integrate two cultures, they can often be quite head on as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think in my mind, there's really three big aspects of integration. And I think this, I had two experiences within Google around integrating acquisitions of very different sizes. Fitbit was by far the largest. And I think this happens a lot in mergers and acquisitions as well. So the three things are people, product, and tech, right? And I'll talk about those separately. So when you bring two companies together, they've got their established ways of working, right? They've got their established roadmaps, they've got their established plans, and so bringing those together is an additional overhead for everybody involved, right? If they're being asked by the respective leaderships, right, we need to carry on delivering our roadmaps that we've already committed, and you've got to onboard to all the new systems, new IT systems, new laptops, lots of training around the way the acquirer does things. That all has to happen on top. So it's a really big ask for the people, and then, as you say, there's cultural aspects as well, which takes a lot longer to kind of really bed in, and that's going to be an ongoing tax for probably years, sort of post acquisition. So people is a really big challenge, and if you want to bring product or the technology together, you've got to get the people on board first, because they're the ones that are going to actually make the product and technical changes. On the product side, you then got to think, well, where are we now in terms of the two different product offerings that we have for the consumers, or it could be B2B customers as well, and where do we want to take them, and what is the journey that we want to take the customers and the users on? And migrations are never easy. From a user standpoint, you put them through potentially quite a lot of pain in that process, and they don't necessarily get very much for it on the face of it, right? Because all you're trying to do is get the things together so you get the whole team working on a single set of features and move things forward faster eventually, but that speed and velocity isn't going to come for a while.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, on the tech, right? So we might now have our product view, but the underlying technology needs to come together as well, ultimately, to ensure, engineer efficiency, right? If everybody's working on the same tech stack, to the same standards, then we're going to get efficiencies. We're also going to get quality, but there's probably also a bunch of legacy in both products that you're trying to bring together, right? That we end up trying to sort of iron out as well. So all these three things are sort of interlinked, but the way I think about it is that there are really three big problems to solve and think about individually, and all the connections in between.
Yeah, and there's so much of meat in there, right? So I think I agree with you, like people being the bedrock of like any kind of success to kind of like come from an acquisition. The other thing which you had said kind of like early on around the whole research that you were describing, right? Like how you ended up kind of telling the end user more about the value that they get. How did you take that into consideration when the migrations were happening? Because I think often, like as a company or as a technical team, it's easy to make sense of why you want to migrate X to Y, right? But to the end user, it's always like a facepalm moment of like, oh, another migration or like another upgrade that I need to do, right? So what was that messaging or narrative that helped soothe this thing a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most notable migration piece that we've seen so far with Fitbit, and it happened with Nest and other acquisitions as well, is the account migration, right?
Yep.
And so you've got your Fitbit account, and then at some point users asked, well, now you're going to sign in with your Google account.
Yeah.
And a lot of users have a Google account anyway, but then they're kind of like, the challenge, and this comes down to privacy and trust as well, right?
Correct. Is
suddenly you're being asked to sign into a health app with your Google account, and Google makes most of its money out of advertising. And most people don't want to be targeted ads with data that is about their health, right? That's a very reasonable need. And so, despite all of the different controls that we might put in place to make sure that doesn't happen, users still have that fear, right? Yeah. So we've got to help them understand, well, what is the value that they're going to get out of using their Google account or a common account in the general case with a product that we're trying to merge in. And so it's identifying. The biggest opportunities are things like what are the other products that already use that common account that might be useful together with the product that's being merged, so Fitbit in this case. And I think that's a bit of a challenge, because the Google didn't have a lot of presence within the consumer health space at the time. Obviously, there was Google Fit, but with most of Google Fit's functionality effectively being replicated within Fitbit, it's like making those two things talk to each other was not necessarily a big sort of value proposition. So what were the other things? And there was other work going on at the time around the Nest Hub displays. Now, one of the Nest Hub displays that came out a couple of years ago actually has its own sleep tracking functionality. It uses this cool little radar chip on it, which actually tracks movement through the night and can actually help you track your sleep without having to wear a watch or a ring or something while you're sleeping. And that was very much embedded within the Google world. And so one of the opportunities was then to say, well, okay, if you're using that and a Fitbit, then let's bring the opportunity to make those two things work together.
And those associations were easy to make?
Oh, it's definitely not easy, right? It's far from easy. From easy. I mean, I think from the technology of where is the data located to bringing about the whole product story, and really all that journey, making sure that we've got a very clear data privacy narrative and the right controls in place, I think there was a whole bunch of different hurdles that we jumped through to make sure that we really had a strong sort of product narrative, but also privacy narrative at the same time.
And that's a very interesting point, because I think health is something which people do not trust even other humans. Even in the concentric circles that you have with, say, your friends and families and whatnot, it's often one of the things which you only share with, say, the nearest ones, that, I have X health issue, whatnot, right? So kind of getting people to be okay with that is a humongous thing. And then again, the reputation of a technology company, the one that makes money with ads, just does not help with it at all, right? So it's a massive challenge, and congratulations to the team and yourself for actually winning feat on that one, because I think it's a major achievement.
Yeah, and I think it's another thing that goes on in the sort of acquisition strategy and integration strategy thought process from the senior leaders as well. I mean, this is one case, but there are plenty of other examples of branding. Right? Should the brand that's being acquired continue to be maintained? Because that actually gives some sort of separation of the stories. Right? And I think actually, for example, in Nest, Google retained the Nest brand for a long time, and I don't think even Google was mentioned for several years, because there was this concern from users that actually these devices were recording things in your home with the Nest cameras, for example, and users didn't want that to be part of their Google ecosystem. So there's a brand separation as well as a kind of product separation, and over time those were slowly pulled together. As it was worked out how to make that narrative really work for users. And I could be misquoting this, but I think it's probably called goodwill when you acquire a business or something. What is the value of that? So I presume that also goes a large way in the several zeros that come in with the acquisition cost, right? Yeah.
So any major learnings from this whole journey, of course, you described the people, product, and the tech. But then while you were actually, and that's the thing with like product managers, right? Like we have a perfect plan only till it's put in practice. So what happened when it was in practice, and like some learnings which you had just from the ground?
I mean, I think, I suppose my biggest learning is just the level of complexity around integrating two products together. We've affected thousands of employees, and the time it takes. And you can have these ambitious goals of saying, well, we've got to do this in the next 18 months. 18 months sounds a long time when you talk about it, particularly in tech, but actually you get into the details of all the things that you need to do, and the care that you need to take in really getting the users along that journey, and it ends up, the timelines end up being much longer, and I think I developed a really keen appreciation for the challenges around account management as well, right? And it sounds, when you just say, well, okay, I'm going to turn a Fitbit account into a Google account, and somebody re-signs in and boom, you're done, right?
Yeah.
But it's the edge cases, right? I mean, it's, because there's child users, right? There's a Fitbit kids device. There are Google child accounts which are supervised by parents, but they're supervised in different ways in Fitbit and Google, right? So you've got to figure out, well, how are we going to map that to that? And then you realize as you're digging in, well, why can't we just migrate the adults and we'll figure out the kids and they'll come later? It's like, well, yeah, but the adults supervise children, right? You might migrate an adult now, but then they might have a kid, and then they might want a Fitbit, and then we're going to block them from having a Fitbit because they're, they want to supervise that child account, and we haven't made that available. So you've got this whole network of interdependencies, and suddenly it becomes a really, really complicated and challenging problem. And so I think one of the things I would probably spend more time on is figuring out, well, what are the quick wins where we can show value from an acquisition sooner, rather than to try and solve everything first. And but I know as well that if you look for the quick wins, that actually causes headaches later on in the development cycle. So how do you find the quick wins that you can pull out, which aren't going to cause further headaches and prolong the integration cycle later on?
And when you say those quick wins, right, are these wins for the team or for the larger company or for the end user on either side?
I mean, it could be any of the above, right? I think obviously wins for the team, I think, will just sort of build up that motivation, right? And help people through that very, very long process. But even wins for the users and for the product, I think is great to really show that externally that there's value being created, and this is a worthwhile product to continue to buy and to use and to invest in, right? People have spent hundreds of pounds on these watch devices, and they want to know that they will continue to work, and they'll get value out of them. I think so often we see acquisitions, and this is not just talking about Google now, but where a business gets acquired and then there's a realization that this is just too hard, and then the acquired business just goes into decline, and might eventually get shut down, and it's a huge waste of money, time, hope and enjoyment of the product that was originally built. And we want to try and help everybody along the journey.
Yeah, and I think also for a company as large as Google, right? Like, it also depends on what does this acquisition really mean in terms of within the parent, which is Alphabet. Does it sit say a separate organization or a company or whatnot, right? Because I think those all have very different meanings. Like say a Verily, which is also a health company within the Alphabet ecosystem. I don't think it has much to do with say Fit, if I'm not mistaken on that, right?
I wasn't involved with Verily when I was there.
Yeah, precisely. So I think that's kind of the level of segregation, and let's say the border creation, whatsoever, right? Like could also be a change, right? So great. That kind of brings us towards the end of this conversation, Matt. One last question, which I love asking everybody. Any what do you call learnings that you have that you would give as advice to folks who are either working in an acquisition, on an acquisition, or say kind of like on the technology side of it? Like what could they do differently, or what should they be like really mindful of while going through this journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly for as a product manager, right? I felt it was a really privileged position to get involved in a major acquisition, and as a product manager, your normal job is to build products, right? But integrating an acquisition isn't really about building products. It's about kind of taking the existing bits and plugging them together, which I think a lot of product managers may not find that exciting. Or at least not on the face of it. And one of the things that I learned was that actually there were some really, really interesting and unusual challenges that you may never, ever get to experience again in your career right, as you go along an acquisition journey. And so my advice to the product folks out there is, if you do get the opportunity to get involved in an acquisition, whether that's from the acquirer or the acquiree side of things, I would really encourage you to jump in with 2 feet, because I think there's some fascinating challenges, and it just gives you a completely different viewpoint on what it's like to build products in a sort of acquisitive mode rather than organically.
Yeah. All right, Matt, thank you so much. This was an incredibly helpful conversation for me. I got so much value out of this personally as well. And again, I have seen part of your journey in person as well. So I'm just very, very proud of you and the team, how far along you guys have come.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. And for everyone listening to us today, this was Matt Goodridge. He was a group product manager at Google, who was leading the Google Fit team at one point of time and was a subject matter expert for the Google Fitbit acquisition in some sense. We learned a lot through this conversation. Partly, some of the takeaways that I can share more briefly about is when you are building something for the end user, talk more about the value that they get, because end of the day, people are willing to share something that they have only when they know what is it in return that they get. When an acquisition happens, there are several layers that are complex, and it just keeps on getting complicated. But then people matter the most. So when you are moving a herd, make sure they're all moving together and they're all speaking the same language. The product and the technology will come from there. And lastly, whenever you are building something big, end of the day, what really matters is that you just put both of your feet on the ground and go heads down in terms of like figuring things out. So that was Matt Goodridge on today's episode of Building It Big. Thank you again.